Hello, dear students. This recording is on research methods or research strategies. This is essentially the meat of research itself. And these are the methods that will help you tackle your research problems or your research objectives. Now, from the previous discussions we've had, especially on research approach, research designs, and so on and so forth, we essentially alluded to research either being qualitative or quantitative, and even in other cases, mixed methods. Now, these research methods are also tied to a research approach, and they are also tied to your research questions. Essentially, what guides your research question or research objectives guides you to what research method you will have. So let us start with the very first research method, which is the survey research method. We have talked about this, and I'm sure many of you have heard about it. It is essentially a quantitative driven research method or strategy and deals with numbers in particular. Every time you're dealing with populations and you're dealing with variables, you are essentially dealing with, this is what we refer to as variables. This is quantitative in nature. So the survey method deals with what we refer to as naturally occurring phenomena. Whereas in qualitative research, you may want to manipulate a phenomenon, you want to understand it further, or this, with the survey or with quantitative research, you want to see how maybe an attitude or behavior may influence another variable or something like that, where one variable may have an influence over another. So we have seen this research mostly done by, for example, Uganda Bureau of Statistics, where they may want to look at education levels, age, the age brackets that exist in Uganda. Those are basically descriptive research. Or you may want to look at healthcare access and so on and so forth. So a survey is done when essentially we're looking at quantitative type of research. So normally that, as we have said, it deals with primarily quantitative data. So it's normally you'd use this if your research is deductive in nature or quantitative in nature. However, that does not mean if you remember our discussions on mixed methods, one may decide to have a qualitative research but then decide to implement a survey to triangulate the information or the findings in the qualitative research. So it doesn't mean that you can't use a survey if you're doing qualitative research. So it comes into if you in cases of triangulation. Now in this research, one of the important things the researcher must do is sample. Because you're dealing with a population, if it's your primary research method, if you're dealing with a population, you're not going to research you're not going to administer your survey, your questionnaire to every member of every single member of the population, because that's simply undoable. So, for example, if you are trying to find out maybe ICT use of all students in Uganda, secondary or an A level, that is undoable. So what survey research does, it offers what we call sampling, where you pick a sample population which is representative of the general population and you administer your survey to that sample, knowing that the responses that you will get will be representative of the entire population. So take an example. If your research is to find out the use of ICT in teaching and learning among secondary school students, you say, okay, what is the total population of secondary school students is X amount. And of this X amount, how many are rural, how many are urban, how many are male, how many are female, how many are from this region, and maybe from the north, from the south, from central, east, west, and things like that. How many are from this economic income and so on and so forth. So you'd sample from each group, and then you say, if I interview this set of people or I minister to this set of people, then it will be representative of the total. Now, there are also different courses, different subjects on sampling techniques and so on and so forth. We don't cover this here. There are extra courses. There are also extra, the books we have can teach you further on that. But this is just to introduce you that sampling must be part and parcel of a survey research method. Now, surveys are also classified. You can decide to do a survey which is exploratory. We may have just general ideas about a research, about your research questions. This is quite rare, but what we normally see are descriptive surveys and explanatory surveys. So descriptive is that you want to get a description of a variable. Maybe if you are researching on ICT users in Uganda, take an example. What is this category of what economic income of what age bracket from which region and so on and so forth. Um, bank users that have adopted ICT, you may want to have a description of those so that you know this is what the banking industry must look forward to in case they would like to go online. Then you have the explanatory survey. So this is to understand the relationships among variables that may be of interest, maybe a variable between adoption and e-learning and the users that would adopt, maybe secondary school, university, and so on and so forth. If you have different variables that you'd like to find out the relationships between or to affirm or determine. So that would be an explanatory survey. Then there's also classified according to time. Now we saw in our classes, we saw that research can be tied to time, the time horizon. So we have cross-sectional and longitudinal. And we had quite a bit of, I think I gave a few explanations of that, on what is a cross-sectional survey, a cross-sectional research and a longitudinal research. So I don't think this one I really need to spend quite a bit of time on that, but we can have maybe further discussion on a forum, or you can call me individually. But a longitudinal, like we saw longitudinal research, one can decide to look at, for example, a population behavior or attitude or phenomena, maybe from 1960, from the time the 1960s when we had our independence, the 70s, the turbulent times of war, especially during the Idi Amin period, the 1980s, also when we had the coup d'etats with our current president coming in and so on and so forth. Then the years of stability, someone may decide to look at that kind of research. But of course, well, you must have access to this kind of data. Then you have the cross-sectional research would be for a specific period of time. For example, if we're doing research within the period of 2023 post-COVID time, something like that, that is cross-sectional. So this I think we covered quite a bit, and we don't really have to look much at that. Now, we can also have surveys that may be face-to-face. So you may sit face-to-face with a group of people, and as they respond to a questionnaire. I think I gave you an example of the research that I did with the community in India, in Kosi sub-parish. And at one point, in one sitting, I administered a questionnaire, and there was a facilitator and a respondent. So he was giving them that question number one, this is what it means, you translate it to Luganda. The people, then he says the response one is this, response two like that. So depending on which one would tick, so they would tick. Question two like that. So that was face to face, or it would be individual by individual. The other is mail. This is where someone sends a questionnaire via email and people respond. Now, Google, or this one, Google really has a very, very, very good tool um, where you can generate a questionnaire, send it by email to respondents. The responses are sent, and the Google system actually tabulates and even helps you do some minimal analysis. So that is another. The other is telephone, where you may call someone and administer, or a web survey. So the web survey, you have systems like, for example, WebMonkey. I think it's SurveyMonkey, and I think there are many others which help you formulate a questionnaire, send it to several people, they respond, and it collects all your data and can help you also do analysis if you so wish. So how would we carry out a survey? We start with the design of the survey, or rather the questionnaire. So the questionnaire is a very, very important tool for you to begin with. So one, it requires quite a bit of work on your part, because should you not design the questionnaire well, you'll not be able to pick correct or analyzable data. So this must be done together with your supervisor. It must be tested, approved, and then you can go ahead and submit. You must have a sample. We already talked about sampling. Fielding of the survey is you actually administering it. You collect the data, analyze it, then present results. That's the simplest. That's the simplest process. So what should you consider if you're doing a survey research method? What is your research question? So if normally we have a research question that is quantitative in nature, okay, that has, we already discussed research questions and hypotheses and so on and so forth. So if you can refer back to that, what type of research question do you have? Does it presuppose, does it have assumptions attached to it? Then what is your population? That the population, people you're surveying from, are they literate? Do they have what is accessible to them? How can you access them? If, let us say, if I was doing a survey amongst bankers, those would be very literate. I can most likely even send them something on mail or a web survey, because we know they have access to internet and most likely very good internet. What language do they use? Things like that. So that helps you choose clearly what do we want to do. The questions you want to ask, are they, what type of questions? Are they very complex questions? Are they questions that somebody can easily respond to? And this is also where the testing of the questionnaire or the survey becomes really, really key. When you test it, respondents can give you feedback and say, this question I found some bit of time to respond to change it, or giving it to an expert. There are some people who are experts in surveys, in quantitative research, and they know how to spot questions that may be ambiguous, that may collect for you wrong data in relation to your research question, and so on and so forth. Bias. Um, you need to know if your respondents are going to give you accurate information, or other information that may be biased, especially if you're doing research that is contentious in any way. So we need to be careful about that. The cost and time element, the survey method is considered one of the cheapest, because number one, it takes a very short time. If you're going to use, for example, electronic means to collect data, it's one of the cheapest modes. If you're going to do face-to-face, that may be another expensive venture. So you need to think about the administrative costs that come with using this research method. So that ends our look at survey. Let us look at the experiment method. So the experiment method is also another example of a research method that is quantitative in nature. We've already seen some of this in some of the articles that we looked at. If you remember the paper on the hedonic experiment, multitasking, this was an example of the experiment method. So here it's a very controlled investigation. Yeah, it's a controlled investigation. You have where you are manipulating one independent variable to see its relationship on a dependent variable. You saw with the multitasking article, they were looking at how one may feel as the multitasker. Let's just say if I'm using WhatsApp, what are my sensory reactions to it? The pleasure that I derive from it if I'm using multiple, or if I have unitary, or if I'm only doing one thing at a time. What are my levels of pleasure? Feeling that feeling of pleasure, the hedonic experience. So that looked at independent. That was a dependent variable looking at an independent variable. So it also involves testing hypothesis. Again, if you go back to that article, we also saw that, and we already know what hypothesis is from our discussion on hypothesis and research questions. So there are some different basic issues that we are looking at when we are looking at experimental research methods. You have manipulation of an independent variable. The independent variable, you have the dependent and independent variable. So the independent variable essentially is the one whose value remains static, and the dependent will vary depending on how the independent variable is manipulated. So, for example, if you have ICT, the applications on a smartphone, for example, are independent. You have WhatsApp, you have TikTok, and any other. Those are independent. But the dependent variable is how the feeling of pleasure I get from using it. How much more pleasure do I get, let's say, from using PowerPoint as opposed to using TikTok? What's my feeling of pleasure that I get from it? What is the feeling of pleasure that I get if if I'm typing a message as opposed to watching a video? So the applications are independent, but my feeling of pleasure is dependent, because those applications cause a certain reaction in me. So we can manipulate the independent variable, and then the dependent variables, if you play around with the independent variables, they'll have an effect on the dependent variables. You have an assignment of subjects, people whom you're testing. So you may choose a certain different types of respondents. So for example, in the multitasking, they said they're also looking at personality types. So there are people who derive more pleasure from using certain applications than others. Your personality type may be also your age group may vary. So there are people who are more prone to deriving pleasure than compared to others. So these would be your test subjects, your participants, people who are participating in the experiment. So an experiment would look at a control group and the experimental group. So as to get the most accurate results. So your test units are the people whose response to the experiment are measured or observed. So we have there's a difference between a laboratory experiment and a field experiment. So for a laboratory experiment, it's an artificial. There's low realism. That rather it's a very artificial environment. You have fewer variables that come in to interfere in the experiment. So take an example, if a scientist is testing for the effect a drug has on maybe the COVID virus. Within a lab, there's no interfering variable. But if it is in the field, somebody is taking up a particular drug, they may also be taking maybe immune boosters, like you're taking things like lemon and all these concoctions, dawa tea, and so on and so forth. So it may affect your results on how effective a drug may be able to treat the COVID virus. So there's also high control. That's where that's an artificial environment, and of course there's low cost because, and it's also for short duration. But when we come to the field environment, because you're in the real world, yeah, you are in the real world, and the interferences, the extraneous variables, those that come in to interfere with the experiment are quite many. There's low control, and of course it's of higher cost and longer duration. So the subjects may be unaware, while in the previous, the subjects are aware of what is going on. So that ends with experimental research method. We now comes to research methods which may be more qualitative in nature, ethnography. So I don't know if we've discussed this a bit. I think I mentioned that I used it for my methods, my research at PhD level. So this is a very, very much a qualitative research method. If one wants to understand the human behavior within its social context, this is where we would go to, any human being. So for my case, I was looking at a member of a rural community in a healthcare context, and in understanding them as mobile phone users, understanding them within the context of within the healthcare and the rural context. Who is a mobile phone user? And especially in the rural context, who is this person? Their age, their mobile literacy levels, their interest in using ICT. What does the how does the rural context affect them? So in economic terms, can you actually afford to buy a mobile phone? All these things. So this was understanding this person within their context. So ethnography seeks to understand a participant within their context. How does culture affect them? How does the economic structure affect them? And so on and so forth. So normally it's used to study culture, politics, and all these really complex things. And we may assume at ICT we may not have it, but in ICT ethnography has been used even within an organizational context. Why? Because an organization is actually a social context, and organizations come with their own cultures and certain even political structures, behind the scenes political structures that affect use of ICT and so on and so forth. So it can also be used, ethnography can also be used within this context. Ethnography, however, because it's extremely qualitative in nature, it can also be extremely time consuming. I think I gave you an example of a researcher in Tanzania who was studying, looking at interracial marriage in Africa. So she was studying a lady who was white, who was married to a black musician in Tanzania, and she was only studying that couple, specifically the woman's side of things, and it took her a whole year to collect data, a whole year. So it's really time consuming, very, very time consuming. For myself, my research took about 2 years, 2 years of collecting data. So it's something that is really time consuming. There are limitations to ethnographic research. One of the big limitations is because you're spending so much time with participants, one may lose objectivity to the research. You end up sympathizing with the participants, and you may fail to be objective in what you pick out. The other also limitation is, even as much as you may immerse yourself into a culture or a situation, because you're not part of it, you'll not always get the full side of things. There was a story of somebody who wanted to experience what it feels like to be in jail. And this person was actually locked up, spent time there. But one of the participants in jail told the researcher that, for you, you will go away. For me, the convict, I will not. So ultimately, you can't experience fully what the other person is experiencing, because you're actually an artificial element in that research. We come to action research, another qualitative research method. We have seen action research in one of the articles that we saw. This was on groupware applications. So action research is a highly qualitative research method, and it is also participatory in nature. So action research normally deals with practical problems. It looks at a situation where there's a practical problem which would have been identified within the research community, but within a case study where the person is doing their research, they would find that there is a certain lack. So if you remember the groupware application article, it started from the idea of that all groupware all research under groupware applications were done in a laboratory experiment. Okay, so they believe that the researchers were coming from the idea that they wanted to do research with they wanted to do a research in a live environment, in a social environment, because they believed there were underlying social elements that could affect adoption of groupware applications. So they found an organization with a practical problem where they actually needed improved communication at management level, so that practical problem existed. So they applied their action research, and they observed the participants as they were adopting this groupware application. So as they observed, they were also participating within the social environment. As they were observing, they discovered, they analyzed data, and they developed, and from there they discovered that they discovered the underlying social elements that affected adoption of groupware application. So this is where action research comes in. It comes from the previous, if you remember the previous slide, it comes from seeing an actual problem, and as they implement, as they participate, they observe and collect data. So now, if we look at the previous one, action research, action research actually depended on this research method as well, case study. So case study is where you're able to observe something intensely. So for the action research application, their case study was a New Zealand organization. So the case study is also another research method which is highly qualitative in nature, So the New Zealand case enabled the researcher to observe this group of people. They were able to observe the management team that was adopting the group application. They were able to observe the IT team that felt alienated and completely refused to provide support. So the New Zealand organization was the case study. So the case study research method was also applied in this case. So the case study research method allows you to observe certain variables with intensely. And normally for ICT research, especially at master's level, we find ourselves using the case study research method quite extensively. So the case study research method, because it is qualitative in nature, it helps us to build a rich picture of our entity or what it is we're trying to research about. Again, we can refer to the groupware application article, which uses action research, yes, method, and also uses case study. The researchers were able to understand clearly those social structures or social forces within the organization that were affecting adoption of the groupware application. So we use case study when we want to collect rich data or qualitative data, in particular. Now, how do we collect that rich data? How do we collect that rich data? Because case study is focusing on one narrow, very piped image because you're looking within a case. We use triangulation or we use several perspectives to get data. So one may decide to carry out interviews, have a participant observation, for example, the group application, and they can decide to have an online survey in addition. So that gives us a robust picture, gives us all possible perspectives. I gave you that same scenario for the research I did at PhD level. So that what I did there, I had a case study of Nindia Parish where I spent time with healthcare community. I spent time with them for 2 years, observing, recording. I did some in-depth interviews. Although my survey was not online, it was face-to-face. That helped triangulate the observations I had made and also the interviews that I had done. So the different variables I had picked up during observation and interviews, I triangulated that or I affirmed their existence using the survey itself. So that gave me a more robust picture of the picture I painted at the end of the day, describing the context of a mobile phone user in a rural context. So when one is using case study, it is important to have several approaches to collecting your data, not just saying I'm going to do interviews and stop at that. You must do something to observe, participation. Maybe if there was an implementation of an application, you must have a time when you observe users, you observe support from a particular department or business processes that affected uh, the implementation process and so on and so forth. So in a case study approach, um, you have an individual's narration about a particular phenomena. You may have a culture sharing group. You may have this or where you observe particular participants. It may be if it's within an organization, you'd observe how a particular department is maybe affected by a business process or an application. So this involves direct observation, and then you paint a portrait of what is happening. Then you may decide to have multiple cases. Yeah, you may decide to have multiple cases that let's say if it is a school or a university or in an organization, if you're observing a bank, you may decide to pick another bank so that you make comparisons of the two, and it gives you let's say a more substantial, rich picture that you paint for your response. Here we have a description of what a case study research is. Yin has done quite a bit of research, so you can Google him and also use Google Scholar to find out more about the case study research method. So also you have different types of case studies. You have illustrative case studies. So here, this is when you want to describe a phenomena. Yeah. So you use this typically to describe a phenomena, and paint a picture for a research community about that phenomena. The other could be exploratory, where you have a pilot case study, where you may decide to say, we want to implement an application, and then we see the response of the application. So it could be a pilot case study, where you're implementing something for the first time, and you're giving a response to, you're painting a picture of how the case study typically responded. Then you can also have cumulative case studies, where you carry out an implementation of, or study a particular phenomena in several case studies to build a case on variables that, or the picture that has been painted. Yeah. So this one, of course, takes place at different times, and in different cases. Then you have critical instance case studies, where you have one or more sites, where you want to answer the cause and effect of something. So take an example. If you have a critical, if you have if you decide to study maybe the phenomena of e-learning, you have one critical case, maybe in a university, the rest is in a secondary school, the other maybe is in a primary school, or you may decide to pick a case study, one which is rural and the other one which is urban, one with which has is endowed with resources and the other with limited resources. So this would be a critical instance to see, in the different cases, in the varying cases, how a phenomena reacts. So that does it for case study research method. We come to design science research method. Now, here, this is one research method which I want to take particular time on. Why? As long as you're designing an artifact, let's say a model, a framework, or a system or an application, you must use design science as a research method, either design science or action design science, because these are research methods specifically geared to designing of an artifact. If your research question or research objective is design oriented, you must use design science. Yeah. So this research method looks at knowledge and understanding of a design problem and the solutions that are required. That's one of the primary principles around it. So as long as you have designing of an artifact, then this is where design science comes in. So you have a person who uses an artifact. That artifact is meant to address a problem, and the person perceives that either the problem is solved or not solved. So in this cycle, yes, in this cycle of designing, we collect our data as we observe the user, as we design our artifact, as we implement that artifact to solve the problem. We carry out evaluation and also evaluate the person who is using this artifact. So you, the researcher, you collect your data within these two intersecting elements: in using, in addressing the problem, and the perception of the user. Yeah, the perception of the user. This time we collect our data, and this is where our research method is implemented. So design science starts with problem identification. This is the motivation for designing our artifact. So take an example. The motivation, let's say, for designing an e-learning system is to bridge, maybe to bridge the pedagogical gaps of teaching and learning. Pedagogy, if you can just research what pedagogy is, it's a term within the field of education, of teaching and learning. The methods of imparting knowledge or searching for knowledge between students, between the learners and the facilitators. So if the motivation is to bridge those gaps, to enhance teaching and learning, so to enhancing teaching and learning would be our research problem. The research or the objective is to design the e-learning system. So here we say we want to attain or to discover what requirements the e-learning system should have. What are the system requirements? What are the assumptions we are taking about the users, the environment, and so on and so forth. So once we get those, we design and develop our artifact. So once we design it, we demonstrate, or rather, we implement, we evaluate the data. So the proof of concept is the system, but the evaluation, the feedback, is what we essentially communicate to the research world. The feedback is, has it closed the pedagogy gaps? Let me get that word right. The pedagogy gaps. Has it closed those gaps? Has it improved, or has there been improvement in pedagogy? Are the teachers driving in the point further? Are the students are the students picking up the skills faster or better because of the e-learning system? So that's what we communicate. We don't communicate the system. The system is proof of concept, but it is not our research output. Yeah. So the research output, what we're answering is, did we solve the problem of pedagogy? Yeah. So this is where we use the design science research method. This is how design science works. Now, design science is one of the research methods that supports artifact development. Action design science is the other. So action design science was developed because researchers in the field of IS and ICT realized that design science was very much a top-down research method, and they wanted to develop a bottom-up research method, just like action research does. They wanted something that was more participatory, starting from the bottom going up. So it's also another qualitative research method, and it solves an immediate problem, just like action research is looking at a problem that exists in a particular case. It also has the very same concept in mind. So we start with a problem formulation. So just as we saw in the action research paper, where there is in New Zealand, there was an organization that had with a real world problem, but of course they had their research problem that they wanted to resolve. Yeah. So the researcher comes into a real world problem, but with the case in point that they want to solve a research problem that exists. So within that research problem, they develop an artifact that is theory, that has theory ingrained in it. Yeah. So they are creating an artifact that has theory ingrained in it, but implementing it for a real world problem. So we could use something like TAM, for example. TAM is also one of the theories that drives adoption, that focuses on adoption of systems. So once we have it, we come up with the initial concept of the artifact. We implement it in an organization, and as we implement, we participate in the implementation process, we carry out evaluation. So as we're carrying out the evaluation, we go back to redesigning our artifact because it feeds back maybe to our artifact. Maybe if it's not good enough, let us change the design and so on and so forth. So during that rebuilding and participation, we evaluate for the sake of our research. Going back to design science, because design science is collecting data from evaluation, we come back to we go back to the drawing table. So the data we collect we carry out what we call reflection and learning. So the reflection and learning process is also part of the evaluation process. It's reshaping our designed artifact, but it's also reshaping our theory, the theories that drove us first to design the artifact. If they're actually effective in designing maybe an effective artifact or so on and so forth. So that evaluation process brings us to formalizing our research. We generalize our research problem, the artifact we started with, or the problem we started with within an organization. We bring it to the overall world, the research world, which would have pinpointed our research problem. And with that, the outcomes is what we share to the research world. Now here I want to give you the example of the research I did because I used action design research. The real problem was starting with ICT4D that are not sustainable. And the researchers were saying that ICT4D designers do not understand the developing world because they come from a developed world, but they don't understand the developing world or the rural, poor, economically poor context. So what happened? My research started with an artifact that I developed on paper, or theory ingrained artifact, then brought that artifact into the context. I observed the artifact, and when I realized, oh, it was within the context there were variables that I hadn't put into consideration. So, for example, um, um, the mobile literacy of users, the time healthcare workers have, what time do they have to sit down and use a system, and so on and so forth. I went back to the drawing board and redesigned the artifact. Now, in redesigning the artifact, I was also picking up variables. Mobile literacy was one. Time of health workers to sit down and use a system, especially in a rural context. The traditional viewpoint of medical health workers. Do they want to treat a patient online, or they want to see the person face to face? Yeah, those are the traditional views of healthcare workers. Although nowadays I'm hearing that some of these things are changing because we have certain now healthcare services that are online. For example, especially mental health care and so on and so forth. These are nowadays being done online for some people. So, but in my case, in that time scope, those were traditional views that I had to put in point. So in that time, I took time to reflect and learn. And then after that, when I redid my application, put it back in the context and collected more data, I formalized my data. I began to generalize it to the other overall world of healthcare. And after that, I articulated my model, the model which I came up with to show the artifact itself, its sustainability in a rural context, in terms of the users, in terms of the economy, the economic environment in a rural context, in terms of institutions that could support, and so on and so forth. So that's what I communicated back. Here we have a diagram of how the artifact comes out. The alpha version, it's implemented, you come up with a beta version, but the design principles and the users, the overall context is what I reported back, not the artifact itself, but from that evaluation, I came up with the model on design principles, for example, for rural context and who the rural user is, as well as for my case, because I was not just looking at the end users, but I was also looking at institutions that can support sustainability and other rural context variables that would affect sustainability. So that ends it for research methods. These are not all the research methods, but I looked at research methods that you most likely will encounter as an ICT user. So I thank you for listening.